resolve not to run, but to take a stand, saying, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Today we see the foundations undermined all around us. What shall we do, Lord? Shall we fight or shall we flee? Should we stand or should we fall? David tells us why he stood, and I quote, "The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked his soul hates." The Apostle Paul tells us, and I quote, "not to be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good," in Romans 12:21. Today, Lord, our generation stands as heirs to a nation and a legacy suitable for a king, the United States of America. Therefore, help us, Lord, to encourage one another and to trust in the one who knows from beginning to end. This is our time, rife with our challenges. Inspire us, strengthen our resolve, show us the way, and grant us the wisdom to follow in it, that we may be the victorious rather than the victims, standard bearers of the righteousness of God. Amen. And if you'd all please stand together with me, and we will ask our brother John Dixon to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you, John.
Let's do this together.
Yes.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So welcome one and all to our summit today, our leadership summit seminar today, and our battle to save our nation of America, battle for America. The national anthem. Let's invite our sister Carol to come up and sing the national anthem, please.
Sing with me.
Whenever you want.
Okay.
See by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. O'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets that flare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Please be seated. Again, you'll see in your folder a long list of participants. Typically, we like to go around and give everybody a minute or two to introduce themselves, but that would put us an hour behind schedule. So what I'd like to do is just acknowledge and recognize two very special folks. I'm not sure if she's here yet with us today, but Dr. Sen, Dr. New, please stand and be recognized. His bio is in the folder. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you. And we'll be hearing more from you later also. And then our luncheon keynote speaker, Terry Tolosco. Please stand and let's welcome Carrie. Carrie will be speaking later. And I think Rushan Abbas will be joining us soon. She's also, you'll see her bio there as well. She's listed there, and we're looking forward to inviting them back for future conferences. So as you see the list of participants, please be sure to reach out, network with folks that are here today, meet them, connect with them, and many of the folks that are here can bring great value to the work that you're doing as well. So please do meet folks that are your fellow participants today. We're now going to show a video before we introduce our speakers and hear an introduction. So go ahead.
To America. 25 ways the U.S. is being destroyed in under 2 minutes. 1. Open borders and illegal immigration. 2. Rampant crime and unsafe cities. 3. Mass addiction and fentanyl. 4. Election insecurity and interference. 5. The educational indoctrination of children. 6. The asymmetrical weaponization of justice. 7. The destruction of private property rights. 8. Inflation and debt. 9. The global depopulation agenda. 10. Record low fertility and plummeting birth rates. 11. Unaccountable federal bureaucracies. 12. Toxic food supply. 13. Vaccine and pandemic disinformation. 14. The transcontagion and sterilization of children. 15. Overprescription of pharmaceuticals. 16. Destruction of the nuclear family and parental rights. 17. DEI and the new racism. 18. Moral and societal decay. 19. The financing of endless foreign wars. 20. The sprawling surveillance state. 21. The centralization and consolidation of government power. 22. The destruction of trust in institutions. 23. The censorship industrial complex. 24. State media propaganda. 25. The smearing of those who challenge it.
Certainly very sobering, but we can see we definitely have our work cut out for us, which is why we're all here today. So thank you again for coming, and we're going to attack these problems head on today and going forward. I would now like to invite our presenters today, Dr. Frank Kaufmann and Dr. David Burgess, and you'll find their bios in your folder as well. I'm just going to read them for you. Dr. Frank Kaufmann comes from a long history of international peace leadership and from a background in scholarly activism. In the latter arena, he is the founding director and editor-in-chief of the Wikipedia alternative New World Encyclopedia. Dr. Kaufmann's experiences in the areas of war and in the forefront of digital research led him to realize that a free and healthy future for all depends on American patriots turning back current forces hostile to America's founding ideals. Dr. Kaufmann founded the Settlement Project in 2020 in response to a spike in clear and open attacks on America, especially from within. Dr. Kaufmann, through the Settlement Project, organizes, writes, travels, eats, and sleeps the mission to protect, honor, and rebuild a strong and healthy America. Dr. David Burgess is the Education Director for the Settlement Project. Dr. Burgess received his Master of Arts degree from International Studies in Comparative Religion and his PhD in Critical Theory from the University of Washington. Dr. Burgess serves as founding Literature and Politics Editor at the New World Encyclopedia, has served since 2005. Dr. Burgess leads and has led several national and international organizations involved in social and political leadership, education, and mobilization, committed to interracial and intergenerational harmony and collaboration. Dr. Burgess currently advises the Settlement Project in the areas of philosophy, ideology, and the academy. So with that, let's give them both a warm welcome. And on that note, we're going to invite Dr. Kaufmann to come up and share with us a few words about our meeting today and give us a sense of where we're going in our gathering today. Dr. Kaufmann, please come up.
Thanks. It's there. It's with the Word document. Not there's a Word. Thanks. Good, thanks.
I failed to mention his comments are also in your folder. You might find them in there on the left-hand panel.
Yeah, so in the folder is a single sheet, a two-sided sheet that introduces what this program is today. David and I, this is the fourth city. We first started this seminar in Los Angeles, followed by San Francisco. We were in Columbus, Ohio, 2 weeks ago or last week, I can't remember. And so what we would ordinarily do is Carl would finish his introductions and David would get up and start speaking, and the first words you'd hear is some obscure French philosopher, and people would have the rest of the morning to kind of figure out, what am I doing here exactly? So this is the first time we've added an introduction to contextualize what this seminar is about and why. And for those who have never been to Settlement Project meetings, to say just a word about who and what the Settlement Project is. So these seminars are being very well received. We're growing a big family because what tends to be at our meetings, they're not meetings of large crowds or large gatherings, they're meetings of leaders, people that already have influence over a particular subsection of society, or they lead people themselves. The reception is good, and so this word is gaining traction. So I'm very happy to report that. What the Settlement Project was founded in 2020, and it came as a demand. I'm sure many of you have these moments in your life where something comes on you and you must do it. In the middle of 2020, there were two things that kind of overtook me, and one was that to me there was clear and evident, overt, open preparation to tamper with the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election, or not only president, like the entire election in 2020. It seemed too clear to me what was going on, and I didn't see enough being done to prepare or to prevent it. And that caused me great worry or great concern. The other thing was after the 4 years of a prior presidency, America seemed to have fallen into such a bad rift that I'm old, I've lived America for all the decades of my life. I've never seen the enemy from within, like almost predominantly from within. And these two things were what forced me or compelled me to found the Settlement Project. I long for, I hope it's not nostalgia, it's forward-looking. I long for a simple, common-sense America where people are decent to each other, can disagree with each other, help each other in need, don't have, the taste of the air is hostile and fragile now. So the idea of being settled, is that there's something more important than superficial differences, even extreme political differences, that the welfare of our country and its people, you could count on even the person with whom you disagreed most, that when it comes to the safety of our country and the welfare of our people, we wouldn't go below that. That has been lost. And so the idea of settlement means to get settled. What did I write? I wrote, Americans should never have one another as enemies, and it's getting near that. And so settlement is to get back to where we have a base we can count on as Americans. Let me see. with the rise of this kind of internal disease or corruption or hostility to the United States, a big, huge media panoply of tremendous thinkers and writers and speakers. You all have your favorites, Peterson or Bannon or whoever it might be, Carlson, whoever you like. There has yet to become a recognition of the most commonly referred to variants of Marxism. Levin called it American Marxism, I believe. But what David and I built these lectures to communicate or argue for is that what is taking the place of a Marxist attack on America is something far more complex, far more pervasive, far more virulent. And that's the primary reason what we want to communicate with you here today. Just what is the nature of the contemporary ideology that is essentially hostile to the founding ideals of American life and American culture. It was Marxism throughout the 20th century. It is not only Marxism presently, and this is what we're here to communicate. So I just wanted to take a word to give some context before David stands up and starts making you wonder, why is he talking about that? Okay, thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. All right, now time for the obscure fringe philosopher. Anyway, thank you all for coming out on a glorious Virginia day. It's good to be in Virginia, in the house of Burgesses. I feel right at home. And the good news is we've arranged for you guys to all receive. We're at a college, so you get college credit for today's activities. Unfortunately, it is $150 a credit, but anyway, it's good to be here. All right, so this morning we're going to look at two attempts to create a utopian society based on a secular philosophy. First is the French Revolution, the second is the Russian Revolution. We'll see that each of these two revolutions share a basic structure which will help us to understand our current social justice or woke revolution. If you wonder why we study history, it's just the old saying, right? Those who don't learn from history are what? Doomed to repeat it, right? So if we look at these two revolutions and the one that we're currently engaged in, I've identified 6 different points that they all share in common. And so just briefly, the first is they began by challenging religion or truth and redefining or rejecting God on radical terms, right? The second is that they offer their own secular origin story, reimagining original sin and what future peace would look like. Third, they move moral conflict from internal to external, redefining good and evil and value. And then 4, they introduce a vision for a future utopia. 5, they develop and promote an ideology for this utopia, to create this utopia. And 6, and this is the sad part, they label and plan to remove utopia's opponents, right? So each one of these you'll see, and you'll see this slide again because we want to, I think, make the point that we've seen this movie before, right? So the modern age really begins with Descartes, not so obscure actually, and the cogito, which you've all heard before, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But why is it so revolutionary? Until Descartes, the Western world lived with God in his heavens as the subject of the universe, and we were in the object position, his creation. Our task was to live in harmony with God's laws. That was the basically common shared view. There were two pillars of that. One is called the Great Chain of Being. And the medieval world was based on these. The Great Chain of Being was simply their understanding of the cosmos, the cosmology. The earth was the center of the cosmos. God was in his heavens, and everything had its place. This is actually a depiction of God and all the different levels of being, right? And of course, the second was the divine right of kings. Right? This was the medieval political theory. The king was appointed by God and ruled on earth on God's behalf. This was the theory, right, behind it. Now, by the time that we encounter the French Revolution, the old system is beginning to break down. First of all, science. The earth was clearly not the center of the universe, right? And the monarchy, which supposedly represented God, under Louis XVI, was in debt and basically failing and in corruption, right? And there was corruption in the hierarchy of the church as well, right? Although there were many good pious priests, but there were still reforms that were needed. The question is, what kind of reform, right? Oh, wait a minute, I went backwards. Okay. So what the cogito does, what Descartes does, is turn that medieval worldview completely upside down, right? It said that the subject of knowledge, the guarantor of truth, the ground of all truth, right, was none other than the thinking thing, the human self, the human being. So it said, well, I can doubt everything else, God and everything else, my body even, I can't doubt that I'm doing the thinking. So this I is the lone depository of certitude on which other truth depends. So the order of dominion was reversed. The I became the center of the universe. And the existence of God and every other truth depended on this I, this thinking being, not the other way around, right? It was a complete reversal. So human reason became the new order of the day, right? And the task then was to build a world based on reason. In other words, a rationalist revolution. So what are the elements of this new world? Again, step one, redefine God. So in France, the thought that it was developing was based on emerging rationalist thought, and especially the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau was not an atheist, but his supreme being was based on deism. Deism embraced the Creator, but the Creator based on human reason, basically that understanding. It rejected the traditional God of the Abrahamic faiths, right? And it rejected that God interacted with human beings, right? So why is that significant? If God is reason, or reason is God, it changes our understanding of what it means to be a human being and what the problem of evil is. So, and, you know, even during the revolution itself, a little bit later, the more radical revolutionaries even rejected deism, the deist supreme being. They took it one step farther, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but they created a goddess of reason. This is a depiction of them parading the goddess of reason around the streets of Paris, right? This is the extent to which, as I said, reason had to replace God. So they created this festival. It was actually very popular. The crowds loved it, we are told, right? And this replaced the religious rites of the Catholic Church. So Rousseau rejects traditional religion and creates his own origin story. In his story, human beings were originally uncorrupted in what is called the state of nature, right? And in fact, it's been described as the noble savage. It's actually not a term Rousseau used, but it's essentially what he meant. These noble savages, if you will, they were innately good in their natural state. But civilization had created laws for social organization which separated him from his primitive goodness. The problem wasn't human beings, but it was society. Society was at fault, right? So this argument redefined the problem of evil. Evil is no longer a spiritual or religious question, it's a social problem. The problem of evil lay not inside the human heart, in rebellion against the Creator, but in society, in man's ability to pursue his own individual interest, putting him at odds with everyone else. So Rousseau declared in the social contract, and this is a famous saying, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So what is this original sin in Rousseau's philosophy? It was private property. The ability to pursue one's own selfish interests led some to accumulate more than his neighbor, and only served to separate the noble savage from his communal spirit or natural state of goodness. Rousseau's philosophy was in response to Hobbes's. Right? Now, Hobbes had stated, again, this is another very famous saying, in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So Rousseau argued that Hobbes was just projecting the failures of civilization back onto the human being, back onto that state of nature. Right? So, and of course, these two variants are at odds with the traditional view of human nature, right, where we're pulled between spirit and flesh, mind and body, or as they like to say, the better angels of our nature and the devil that sits on our shoulder, right? So these philosophies reject that traditional view. Okay. Having redefined God, human nature, and the origin of evil and the original sin, Rousseau offered his solution. And it's a new utopian vision. For Rousseau, there was no way back to that primitive state, to that uncorrupt state. Human beings were forever corrupted. But it was possible to change society, to change civilization, to change the social order, and so in that process, human beings could be perfected. This approach is one that would be adopted by all future revolutionaries. We'll see this again. It's society that's at fault. It's society that must be changed so that we can be good. So, yeah. So how is the society to be reformed? Rousseau's theory required, since, human beings' individual will had been corrupted, then it needed to be replaced by something he called the general will, which essentially, what's in the best interest of everyone, right? Now, so by pursuing this general will, mankind could create a new state based not on the old superstitions like the church and the monarchy, but based on reason, okay? So that's basically the philosophy that underlies the French Revolution. And if that was the end of it, this would be a nice historical curiosity for people like me who enjoy this kind of things, right? And I wouldn't be bothering you with it. But it didn't end there, right? Because for a philosophy or an idea to become a revolution, it first must be turned into an ideology, right? Ideas matter, but they don't make revolutions by themselves. They are, I say they're necessary, but they're not sufficient, right? So, what is an ideology? And this is a philosopher by the name of John Kekes, and he gives a great summation, and I'll just go through it here. An ideology is a worldview that makes sense of the prevailing political conditions and suggests ways of improving them. Typical ideologies include, among their elements, a metaphysical outlook that provides a God's eye view of the world, a theory about human nature, a system of values whose realization will supposedly ensure human well-being, an explanation of why the actual state of affairs falls short of this perfection, and a set of policies intended to close the gap between the actual and the ideal. This last component, commitment to a political program and its implementation, is what distinguishes ideologies from religious, personal, aesthetic, or philosophical systems of belief. ideologies aim to transform society. Other systems of belief do not involve such a commitment, but if they do, they become ideological. Right? So, where does Rousseau's philosophy become part of an ideology? The first ones to do so were the Jacobins and their leader, Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre. They were the most radical of the French revolutionaries. Right? And Robespierre, by the way, was an absolute strict believer and follower of Rousseau. In fact, he believed he was personally anointed to implement Rousseau's vision. So it was left to Robespierre and the revolutionaries to take Rousseau's ideas and turn them into a radical ideology, a revolutionary ideology. So those are the ideas behind the, oh, excuse me, I went back again. All right. But again, one pressing question remained. Remember the general will. What is the general will? What is the thing around which everybody unites and we have this new society? Well, frankly, Rousseau never gave an answer. So it was left to the implementers of the ideology, right? And Robespierre. Robespierre's answer was very simple. As the leader of the Revolutionary Party, he was the one who was in the best position to decide what the general will required, right? So the general will is what Robespierre says it is. And this is the point where you have a disconnect between the idealist utopian philosophy and where the ideology begins and the problems originate, right? So this revolution that was philosophically supposedly based on reason and the general will was grounded in reality in a political struggle between those who wanted to reform the ancient regime, the old French regime, and this included some moderate revolutionaries as well. And they're on one side. The other side is the clergy and those people that were part of the old regime or the emerging bourgeois class. So, the radical revolutionaries represented the working poor of Paris, basically, and that was the so-called sans-culottes, which is a term about their dress, their clothing, but they were basically the working poor. And also they had a Parisian government that they instituted called the Paris Commune. Right? And the Jacobins then were on the side of the sans-culottes and the Paris Commune. So their philosophy then, having rejected the traditional religious view, and especially this notion of the infinite value of the individual, which all religions essentially have, right? Good and evil is based now on whether you support the revolutionary cause or not. Right? So the revolutionaries attacked the clergy, and they required the priests to swear allegiance to the state. Now, so they're the revolutionaries are the representatives of reason, and reason dictates that they must follow the state, because the state is implementing this new utopian world, right? So the clergy, therefore, were required to have an oath to the state and not the Pope, right? And this was actually on pain of death. Those who refused to do so could be executed, and some were, right? So also the revolutionaries seized the church's assets. And those who resisted the government's imposition of this so-called general will, they were branded as enemies of the revolution. So, again, this is a historian by the name of McPhee. Many historians have seen this civil constitution of the clergy, which was the law that they enacted to seize the church's assets and to require them to swear allegiance to the state, as the moment which fatally fractured the revolution. In the end, it proved impossible to reconcile a church based on divinely ordained hierarchy with a revolution based on popular sovereignty. these two things clashed, right? So what do you do about that, right? And then in January of 1793, they executed the king, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette, his queen, and abolished feudalism. So having done all of this, they created enemies. They created these enemies within the nation and within the neighboring countries as well, who were afraid that this would spread to their nation, right? And it led to civil war inside of France and also wars with their neighboring countries. So what do? You represent reason. You're creating utopia. People are resisting. What's your response, right? Well, what they did was they created a revolutionary army of these sans-culottes, the working poor, to attack the enemies of the revolution. The Revolutionary Army was charged with enforcing the will of the government and eliminating its opponents. The question so many have asked for so long now is, how is it possible that the revolutionaries who were committed to creating a government based on reason, not on the tradition and superstition of the past, could end up in the reign of terror, right? How does that happen? So when they faced opposition to the actions that they took to replace the old superstition, right, and created by self-interest of private property, they labeled those who opposed them as tyrants and made a plan to eliminate them. So this is actually another quote from Keke's. Put another way, this is the rationale here. Uncorrupted human beings would intuitively recognize and act in the general interest. So any divergence between the individual and the general interest indicates the individual's immorality and irrationality. If any individual fails to see that his true interests are the same as the general interest, and as an aside, in other words, what the government tells you, he must be forced to act as if he did for his own good, or else, right? Or eliminated, right? And apparently this is the dictate of reason. This is what reason requires. So Robespierre, he's often referred to as the virtuous, the uncorruptible one, right? At the height of the terror, he says, without virtue, and this is supposedly a revolution of virtue, that's his favorite word. Terror is deadly, but without terror, virtue is impotent. He also said, terror is only justice, prompt, severe, and flexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. Another quote I don't have up, we must smother the internal and external enemies of the Republic or perish with it. Now, in this situation, the first maxim of your policy ought to be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror. So, these are the dictates of reason, right? So what comes of it? Well, as I say, this is the rationale for the reign of terror. And I argue it's not a bug in the system, right? It's a feature of the revolution. It was the plan. When each person does not have infinite value, and good and evil is decided by which side of the political aisle you're on, then those who oppose have to be eliminated. It's just reason. So as you see, these are figures, estimates for how many were arrested and killed during the reign of terror. Eventually, they even turned on one another. And the revolutionaries themselves that were in the National Assembly started accusing each other and executing one another. And a lot of this was under Robespierre's leadership. And finally, people said, well, this is going to go on until we're all dead. And so they executed him as well. Right? This is a very famous quote from a revolutionary from another party, the Girondin party. He says, "It is to be feared that the revolution, like Saturn, will end up devouring its own children." And in fact, he was executed by Robespierre. So, once again, we've redefined God. We have a secular origin story about the noble savage and how private property is now the new original sin. And so the conflict is removed from an internal struggle between good and evil to good and evil camps within the society. And of course then, in order to create the new utopia, the evil people have to be destroyed. Right? And that's the logic. Okay. So this is one you guys are probably a little bit more familiar with, but the pattern is the same. So first of all, Marxism is atheistic. Right? Between the French Revolution in the late 18th century and the rise of Marxism in the second half of the 19th century, there were a number of developments. Deism was no longer popular. And this idea of creating a society based on reason, again, had been rejected with the failure of the French Revolution. Right? So atheism replaced deism. Right? And of course, Marx was the consummate atheist. Right? So between the 18th and 19th century, the critics of religion moved away from all of this and rejected God entirely, right? And this is, of course, their very famous quote, which I'm sure you've all heard, right? Religion is the opium of the people. Right? He openly expressed hostility towards God and religion, but beyond his own personal antagonism, he viewed it, and I think quite rightly so, as an anti-revolutionary force. Like traditional concepts of right and wrong do not permit the kind of violent revolution that he advocated, right? He sought to replace religion with a new kind of secular system based on no longer reason or rationality, but now on materialism. So again, there's a little history between the French Revolution and Marxism after the Napoleonic age, which followed the collapse of the French Revolution. There was a young German philosopher by the name of Hegel who attempted to create a system that would unify rationalism and its critics, right, into a unified system. Hegel and idealism dominated the first half of the 19th century. And Hegel's social theory in particular saw history as the working out of spirit coming to know itself through human history. So this spirit also is a philosophical way of even incorporating, sort of a religious idea. The Holy Spirit there's a resonance there, right? But anyway, it's a whole philosophical system that's designed to explain the whole history of humanity and its goal, right? And its goal was this coming together of subject and object in knowledge as God comes, or spirit comes to know itself in human history. All right, we don't need to go any deeper into Hegel here, but that's important for understanding Marx. So Marx adopted Hegel's theory of history, but he argued that Hegel was upside down. He had it wrong. It was materialism that drove history, not idealism. And he famously said he found Hegel on his head and turned him right side up. Although you've all heard the saying that he turned Hegel on his head, right? But in fact, that's neither here nor there. But yeah. So he replaced Hegel's mythology with one of his own. His theory was historical materialism. Like Rousseau, he argued that humankind was originally free, but he didn't romanticize it. we were free, but we existed in poverty with scarce resources, right? And he called this original state primitive communism or primitive society, right? And this is the Marxist founding myth of the history of the world, right? It's the one which replaced both Rousseau's but also the Judeo-Christian one as well. So, according to historical materialism, the solution to the problem. Is there another bottle of water somewhere? The solution to the problem of scarcity was division of labor to grow wealth. Right? Rousseau believed that private property was the original sin, as you recall. Marx didn't disagree with him, but he viewed it as a necessary evil. This outcome produced wealth, but also unequal development and inequality. Right? So essentially what happened is this division of labor, created classes, right? And it created a ruling class, who he viewed as oppressors, and a working class, the laboring class, and they were the ones who were being exploited, right? So it's this inequality of the classes that's the new original sin, which could only be overcome through violent revolution by the working class. So the goal of history was material, achieving ever greater material well-being. Right? Like Hegel, this process necessarily took place through conflict, which Marx called dialectical materialism. Right? And these are the eras that he sees in which the dialectic is working, and material is basically working its way out through human beings to create a society that flourishes. So instead of spirit, it's material, basically coming to realize a just society. That's the mythology of Marx. So in this new mythology, then, Marx redefined human nature on a materialist basis. Right? All history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature. Right? So men begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. Right? This is from the German ideology. Right, so this is again Marx's new understanding now of what is human nature. Right? So as with Rousseau, human nature doesn't have fixed immutable characteristics. Right? It can't for these philosophers, because otherwise changing society in order to perfect humanity, it's not going to work. Right? So his materialist view is simply that human beings are created by their environment, essentially by the modes of production in which they live. Right? This view is also influenced by Darwin as well. So since human nature is determined by the economic system, good and evil can't be applied based on moral principles. Moral principles are nothing but the values of the ruling class imposed on those that are ruled. Right? They are designed to maintain the status quo of the ruling class. Marx instead argued that good and evil depended on whether actions promoted the revolutionary actions of social change that he proposed. Right? Violent revolution is good, because it brings about the good society that will eliminate the oppressors. So what is this utopian ideal of Marxism? You've all heard this: from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So how does that get realized? Well, Marx's theory predicted that the working class would achieve what he called class consciousness. It meant they would understand their role in creating this utopian future. they would rise up and overthrow the capitalist class, ushering in a classless society which would achieve the goal of historical materialism, eliminating the history of inequality and oppression. That was the theory. But it didn't happen. The proletariat never achieved this so-called class consciousness in the Marxist sense. They created trade unions to promote their own economic and political interests. And guess what? They succeeded in creating better lives for themselves within capitalism. Right? Rather than overthrowing capitalism, they made it stronger. Plumbers make more than we do. It's a great thing, right? So, and so revolution never happened, right, in a single capitalist society. There are no capitalist societies that had a Marxist revolution. As with the general will in the French Revolution, this is where the theory breaks down. The so-called proletariat class never fulfilled what Marx said they would do, right? So then what happens? Well, the idea was they would create socialism, right, on the right, and then out of socialism, a classless communist utopia would develop. But, as I said, it didn't happen. Communism was supposed to be the stage after socialism, but instead, communism actually became synonymous with a system of state control, right? Of imposed from a strong state, right? So how did that happen? Well, the Bolshevik Revolution happened, right? Led by Lenin, they took advantage of another failing monarchy, as the French revolutionaries did in France, right? Like Robespierre and the Jacobins, they took the Marxist philosophy and created a revolutionary ideology. Marxism was a philosophy. It didn't ever make a revolution. Leninism, however, took Marx and made it into a political program, right? So the spontaneous uprising of the proletariat never happened. So Lenin argued instead that what was needed was a vanguard party, a tightly organized state party, disciplined, centralized, revolutionary party that would make all the decision. So basically Lenin was the new Robespierre. And like Robespierre, Lenin became the last word in what Marxism meant. And like the Jacobins, they faced internal and external opposition. Like the Jacobins, they sparked a civil war within their country. It lasted several years, right? And wars with their neighbors as well. They created class enemies, right? It was a replay of the French Revolution, except Marx had learned from the French Revolution, so he already built class enemies into his theory, right? So they knew they had enemies that they would face, right? And they identified them and attacked them, right? So, like the revolutionary army that was created by the French government, the Bolsheviks created the secret police, or the Cheka. This was the ancestor agencies to the KGB, right? And they were charged with eliminating class enemies. And then, of course, later, under Stalin and the Gulag, they made millions of class enemies disappear. So Grigory Zinoviev was a close ally of both Lenin during the early stage and then Stalin later on, and was later executed by Stalin, but that's another story. But he said in 1918, to overcome our enemies, we must have our own socialist militarism. We must carry along with us 90 million out of the 100 million of Soviet Russia's population. As for the rest, we have nothing to say to them. They must be annihilated. Casually, murder 10 million people. So there's no talk of virtue here, as there was in the French Revolution, just terror. Right? They had a clear sense of mission here. And this was the Ukrainian Cheka chief, right? This is even more frightening, right? Do not look in the file for incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. If you have the wrong identity, too bad. So, Marx imagined the revolution would eliminate the bourgeoisie as a class, but he thought that class would be very small by the time the revolution happened, and it would be one simple little cleansing operation, right? But this class warfare was central to Leninism, right? And it was the principle on which the Soviet government was based. Again, when you reject the notion of the infinite value of each person, and you have these enemies that stand in the way of your utopian goals, what choice do you have? These people stand in the way of utopia, right? Well, these guys were pikers compared to Stalin, right? This is a great, the theory of Marxism was that the state would wither away. It would just be this, workers' paradise, right? And Stalin recognized there was a little complication with that. We are for the withering away of the state, because it's Marxism, right? At the same time, we stand for strengthening of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which represents the most powerful and mighty of all forms of the state which have existed up to the present day. The highest development of the power of the state, with the object of preparing the conditions of the withering away. So we have to make a huge, gigantic state so that it can all wither away, right? Is it contradictory? Yes, it is contradictory. But the contradiction is a living thing and wholly reflects the Marxist dialectic, right? So actually, far from withering away, they built the largest state apparatus for control that has ever been seen up to that time. So state repression began under Lenin, but it was greatly expanded under Stalin. And this is, again, one of Stalin's great quotes: "Death is the solution to all problems. No man, no problem." It began like in the French, they began by attacking external enemies and also different parties. Also, like the French Revolution, it expanded to murdering political rivals, people who potentially could threaten Stalin's power inside the party. Right? And that was the term that's used there is the Great Purges. And it's, I would call it the reign of terror on steroids, right? So the whole notion, I'm sorry, this is another good quote. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. So the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, was the watchword, right? It ended in the reign of terror. It killed tens of thousands. Peace, land, and bread was the motto of the Bolsheviks, right? It ended in the Gulag, right, which killed tens of millions. So, I merely would like to point out, and you'll see this slide again, and this whole recitation of history is prologue to understanding the situation we find ourselves in now. Once you deny the existence of any higher power and offer a new secular version with a new future utopia, and we remove the notion of good and evil from individual people into the society writ large, then those that are on the right side have to eliminate those that are on the wrong side in order for the utopia to happen, right? And that's the pattern that we see again and again. Anyway, I'd like to say thank you for your support.